It's Wednesday night, and we're studying through the Old Testament. This is a very difficult ordeal knowing what to approach first to me. I've got all these avenues that I can go into. What I'm trying to do is to give you a basic understanding of the Bible by taking you through each book. When you're going through a book, let me encourage you to do this. If you're going through Genesis, you look at Genesis 1. You don't try to remember all the verses and memorize everything word for word. You look at Genesis 1 and you see some high points in it. You see the creation. Then you see without form and void. And then you see the 6 days of making and forming. Make and form. And I keep saying, remember that the word make is not the word create. And I'm not going to go into this again. We don't believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. The Bible doesn't teach that. When people speak of the 6 days of creation, they're talking about the 6 days of making and forming. God created in the first verse, and then the earth becomes without form and void, and then he says, let there be light. Let light be. And he's not talking about, that's not when he created light. He created the light in the first verse, and then darkness comes upon the surface of the depths of the earth, and he says, let the light in. That's been shining from the first verse. Been shining for millions of years from the first verse, because light travels at 186,000 miles per second. So when he says, let there be light, he's saying, let this light in that's been traveling for millions of years to get here. There's supposed to be a crust around the earth. So think of these things. When you get into Genesis 2, when you get to Genesis 2, you think of, I think of God forming man. God forms man. And this is a high point of the dust of the ground. Now, the word form does not mean to create. Form is the word yatsar. It's the same word as potter. It's a potter. So God picks a man, creates him, and when he forms him, and when he creates him, he breathes into his nostrils. Breathes. And then into his nostrils, that's the creation there. David said in the Psalms that he created with his breath. Breathes into nostrils the breath of life. And then you go on down and you see that God creates man. He makes man and he creates him by breathing into his nostrils. And then he makes woman out of man's rib. Makes woman. And then he sets up he sets up the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden in that second chapter. And he sets the Garden of Eden, and he tells you where it's located. There's some rivers there in that second chapter, and those rivers where the Garden of Eden are equated to be set up are between the Euphrates and the Nile River. So if that is the area of Eden, and he sets up a garden eastward in Eden, then you come east of Eden and you get over here. There's an old movie called East of Eden. You come over here, eastward in Eden, and you find that the Garden of Eden is believed to be over here, somewhere in the neighborhood of the Euphrates River, about where they built Babylon. Well, if Babylon is the mother of harlots, that was built after the flood, where they reinstituted Garden of Eden worship. They started worshiping Noah as the fish god and so forth. Now, and originally, when you go to the 15th chapter of Genesis, the boundary line of Israel was the great river of Egypt to the Euphrates. So Israel and the Garden of Eden were in the same land area, in this area right here. So that was the original boundaries of Israel, but through the thousands of years and the millennia, all these boundaries changed due to wars, due to people deserting a land and leaving it alone, and somebody else coming in and possessing it and going to war that were neighbors and annexing land and so forth. So Eden is in this proximate area right here. Eastward in Eden is going to be over here on the Euphrates or in what we call Iraq. That's probably where Eden was located. Now, so he creates Eden here, and then he makes woman out of man's side, and he tells Adam, thou shalt not eat of that tree. And he makes two trees there. He sets a tree in the midst of the garden. That's the one he says, thou shalt not. It's this one right here. He says, you got all these other trees, and you can eat of those. And don't want to go any further than that. So that's the second chapter. The third chapter, Eve looks at the tree, looks. Always notice, Eve looks. That's the first thing that happened. She looked. Remember idolatry? Idololotreia. Idololatria means to latruo. Ido means to serve what you see. Eve looked, and she began to serve what was in the tree. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. And then Adam and Eve, and of course that's the three things she saw: a tree of good for food, pleasant to the eye, make her wise. Same three things with 1 John 2:16, 17. And we see that Eve looks, and she gives to Adam. Gives Adam. He eats. He eats, and Adam and Eve try to cover their bodies with the fig leaves. With the works of their hands, they try to, and God kills an animal to cover the sacrifice, to cover their nakedness. It took a blood sacrifice in the garden. And then he drives them out of the garden. He gives them the curse upon them. The woman will have children in pain, birth, and the man will earn his living by the sweat of his brow. He gives that in that second chapter. And then he drives them out of the garden, puts a sword at the entrance to the garden. And you get into that fourth chapter and you get Cain killed Abel. Cain, Abel. I'm just kind of showing you a little bit how to look at chapters. Look at the main points in the chapter. That way, if you remember these points, you'll remember what's going on. And Cain kills Abel. And then God says, where's your brother, Abel? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? He was diverting the question, wasn't he? He was trying to skip out on responsibility. So God, in that chapter, in verse 25, God has Adam knew Eve, and she conceived and bare another in the place of Abel, whom Cain slew, and his name was Seth. And then you get into chapter 5, and you get the lineage of Adam. But Cain is not in this lineage. And it takes a lot of study to understand that a bastard son is called a mamzer in the Greek, mamzer. And he doesn't have any inheritance, never any inheritance in an Israel household. So Seth takes the place of Abel, who has the correct, he had the blood sacrifice, his brother had the works of his hands. Always the works of the hands is the wrong sacrifice. So as you're going through these chapters, of course, that chapter 5 takes you all the way down. God had a son, his name was Adam. Adam had a son, his name was Seth. You go down through Enosh and Canaan, Mahalalel, all the way down to Noah. And Noah's got a son, his name is Shem. And out of this will come Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you'll begin to see that. Look at the basic structure of a chapter and the main points in it. If you try to memorize it verse by verse and get every point of the chapter, you won't begin to remember it. It'll take you years. If you're reading a chapter, you'll find in my Bible I highlight the high points of the chapter. And eventually, as you read that chapter, those high points pull the rest of the chapter together in your mind and in your thinking. I do that with all chapters of the Bible that I study. I say, well, over here, in this second chapter of 2 Thessalonians. You got talking about the Lord coming back, and you talk about the mystery of iniquity and how the man of sin will rise up in the temple of God, or hey, he's already done that, and how the mystery of iniquity is already here, and then he sends strong delusion that they'll believe a lie because they receive not the love of the truth. And I think of those high points in a chapter. And that's the way to remember the Bible. I just wanted to say a few things like that. That's how I'll go through those books of the Kings, remembering the high points. Remember who was married to who killed who, when a certain person was born, what his position was in that line. We're trying to learn the Bible. And if you'll stick with us here, over a 2-3 year period, you'll begin to see the whole picture of Scripture. Now, where we have been going, I've been really wrestling about what to do tonight on whether to start in Samuel, but I'm not really. I'm going to start rotating my messages between Exodus. I'm going through the Bible. I started with Genesis. It took us about 2.5 years to go through Genesis. We got to Exodus, and I'm bogging down in all these laws. And I know we need to get over to 1 Samuel. When you look at the Bible, here's the way you need to look at it. You need Shammah. Samuel comes from Shammah. What is the word Shammah? Here. And El. Okay. Shammah and El. It means heard of the Lord. Samuel was, not only was his mother, Hannah, heard of God, but Samuel heard the Lord. And we'll get into that. So it comes from Shammah El. Now, Genesis is about the creation, down through Noah, down through Adam, through Noah, down to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. There in the 32nd chapter of Genesis. And then Israel has 12 sons, and then they're in bondage for 400 years. When Joseph, the 11th son, is sold into bondage, and then they go to Exodus, and they come out of bondage, Exodus, and they come out of bondage in the 12th chapter, and then they get to Mount Sinai in that 18th chapter, and then they work their way through. In Numbers, the 10th chapter, they leave Sinai, 10th chapter, and the book of Numbers is about, the whole book is about Israel's traveling in the wilderness for 40 years. The tribes are certainly numbered, and the people are numbered and named, but it's about the time from they leave Sinai, they travel through the wilderness for 40 years, they come up just north of the Dead Sea, and it's all that time. It's the time in the wilderness. Time in wilderness. Wilderness. Of course, we said that Leviticus means the law of the Levites, the priest. Well, you get over here into, they're leaving here, and in Numbers, they're leaving Egypt. They left Egypt in Exodus 12. They get to the mountain in 18, 19. Moses goes up on the mountain. Exodus 20 gets the 10 Commandments and comes down. When you get to Numbers 10, they leave the mountain and go on their journey into the wilderness. Wilderness. They had a journey down to Sinai, starting in that 12th chapter, down through the 19th chapter. Then when they get over here in Numbers, in all that's going on in Exodus, the 18th, 19th, in particular the 20th chapter, when the 10 Commandments is brought down to them, what's going on from Exodus 20, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Leviticus is the Levitical law. And the law that's given here in 20, 21, 22, 23, this is mostly laws that they have to live by in a civil sort, in a civil sense. These are laws that are given to them for daily life and daily living. The Levitical laws are about the sacrifices in the temple and how it's all made up. You'll find some of that in Exodus. And then Numbers is about their journey in the wilderness. Deuteronomy. When you think of Deuteronomy, think last book of the law, book of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible are called the law by the Jews. Well, when you get to Deuteronomy, it comes from duo and nomos. Nomos is the Greek word law. Duo means second. It means the second law, or it's the second witness, as the Bible tells us. Numbers 35 and Deuteronomy 17 and Deuteronomy 19, it takes 2 witnesses to verify anything in Israel in their courts of law. Soon as Deuteronomy is written right before they cross the Jordan River to take possession of land, at the end of Deuteronomy, the last chapter of Deuteronomy, Moses dies. Joshua leads him over. In the next book, guess what is Joshua? Joshua leads them into the land. Joshua's job is to divide the land between the patriarchs. The patriarchs are the sons of Jacob. And here's their division of land right here. In this here. Simeon is the second-born. Reuben's the firstborn. Here's Judah, the fourth-born. Benjamin's the 12th-born. Ephraim is the second-born son of Joseph. Instead of Joseph having a tribe, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, why Manasseh gets more land, I don't know. Maybe this is more wasteland. I believe it is. And then Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali and Asher and so forth. So it's divided up. That's what Joshua does. He goes in and declares war with the people that have taken over this land since they've been gone for 400 years. He says, this is our land, God gave it to us. You say, that don't sound fair. Well, what do you want? God says it belongs to Israel. I gave it to them. Remember, back in the 12th chapter of Genesis, God brought Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees and brought him over here and gave him that land. Said, it's yours. Don't matter who moves in a 400-year period. It's yours. The same way with the Palestinians or the Philistines. Now, as we go through here, Joshua judges. A judge was a ruler. You had all these different judges. We went through them last week. You started with Othniel, and you went on down through Ehud and Deborah and Shamgar, and down through Tola and Jair, all the way down to Samson and Gideon. Of course, Gideon. Don't want to leave him out. And don't want to leave out Jephthah. And go to Samson, and the last judge of Israel is Samuel. And that's what takes us into the book of Joshua judges Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, Ruth is in there because Boaz, the husband of Ruth, is in the lineage of Jesus, and Ruth is one of Jesus' ancestors in the 1st chapter of Matthew. And I've tried to figure out why that was inserted there particularly, and I believe it's because of that lineage. Then you get into 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel. And we go through the kings of Israel. 1 Samuel through 2 Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Chronicles. This is the history of Israel under kings. History under kings. And then, of course, they go after Baal and the Grove and Shemash and Molech and all these gods. And God scatters them. And He kept them scattered for 2,600 years until May of 1948. 1948. And this is a general picture. And when He brings Israel back, we'll be at the end of time. Well, they're back. And that's not the only proof we have that the end of time is here. I mean, when we look at our world situation, our world economy, that is what you call famine. All of the disease of the world, that's called pestilence. These 4 judgments of God, the sword, the famine, the pestilence, and the beast. And the beast is going to be the system that takes over at the end of time. So whenever you see this, you see a general picture. Israel, I've told most of you here, when I look at the Bible, I see a picture. I see this picture in my mind with all these different characters. I can take any one of these points and talk about it for 2 or 3 hours. I've studied this for a lifetime, and all this stuff is going on in my head, and I don't know why God let me see it. Just, He's given me a perseverance to study it. And you can learn it too if you start now. If you're young, you got lots of time. Lots of time. Now, I want us to go back where we've been. We've come out of Egypt, brought Israel out of Egypt. We've gotten to the everyday civil laws that God's going to use. They're not laws of the land. They're laws of the land as far as God is concerned for Israel, His people. Here's Israel here. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Egypt. And the delta is all those rivers coming off the Mediterranean Sea and going down here on through Ethiopia and so forth. And here's Israel, just a little nation. The land area is smaller than New Jersey, and all of the world is looking at it right now. The whole entire earth. Abraham came out of the Ur of the Chaldees and came over here and possessed it. God gave it to the sons of Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons, and they are the nation of Israel. Now, what we're doing is we're talking about they were chosen by God. God says, you didn't choose me, I chose you. He told Israel, I didn't choose you because you were the greatest of nations. You're the smallest, the most insignificant. Sounds like the elect church of the New Testament, doesn't it? The few are going to find the narrow way. Are there few that be saved, Lord? That is the few. They're chosen by God, but not everyone in Israel was chosen. Only the ones that God put belief in their hearts, the same way the church is. To be a Jew, you have to be a Jew of the heart. Now, what we're talking about they're down here on Mount Sinai, somewhere in this Sinai Peninsula. I believe that. I know a lot of the scholars say, well, they were in Arabia. Sinai's in Arabia. The 4th chapter of Galatians says Sinai is in Arabia. But we have no idea today what the boundary lines of Arabia were back 4,000 years ago. Besides that, there were about 2.5 million people moving with Moses. I doubt seriously if they got very far over here in Arabia. Now, God certainly would feed them with manna in the morning and doves in the evening, and He would keep their feet from swelling, and their shoes wouldn't wear out, and their clothes wouldn't wear out. He said that was part of the blessing He had upon them. But it's going to take too long for them to get way over here in this part of Arabia. This very well could have been Arabia over here 4,000 years ago. The borders changed depending on the wars and concessions that are made by various countries to other countries and in their quarrels and in their differences. Now, where we are, let's go back over here to Exodus. Exodus, the 21st chapter. I've been trying to get into this, and I'm going to start reading it. We may just do a lot of reading tonight. This is Israel receiving they receive the righteous laws of God concerning how they're to live towards God and towards others. We've said all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. When we speak of the law, God's law is tougher in New Testament times than it was in the Old world. Because if all the law is fulfilled in one word, all law is fulfilled in one word. One word. Even this, thou shalt, Galatians 5:14, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, when we looked over here in Exodus 20 at the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, the first 4 commandments were about loving God. Love God. And the second 6 and 4 is 10, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, was about loving the neighbor. And Jesus, in the 10th chapter of Luke, the lawyer came to Jesus, or the scribe. He was actually a scribe. That's what they called a lawyer. They knew the law backward and forward, the law of the Jews. And the lawyer asked Jesus, what's the first and great commandment? He said, to love the Lord thy God. And the second is like unto this, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So he was talking about in the commandments of God, but that's not all there is to the law. And when you get in the 21st chapter, you're seeing all these different daily laws concerning any kind of damages to one another, or we don't know how to live in our life. We don't know what to do when somebody's tree is hanging over in our yard and the limb is dead and it falls in our yard, whether we need to cut it off or pick it up, or he's real grouchy and he's going to start a fight with us. Understand? Or you borrow your lawnmower from your neighbor and you break it and you don't get it fixed and you take it back and he gets mad and you're in trouble with your neighbor. These laws, starting in the 21st chapter of Exodus, will tell you what to do. It won't say lawnmower, but it will say bullock. It will say a sheep or a ram. When you mistreat something, he'll tell you how to live. And we struggle with that every day, don't we? That's why people argue all the time, back and forth with each other. But there's more to the law in this. Anytime you find an imperative mood in the New Testament, that is a command. And if the Bible is the inspired Word of God, it is the Holy Spirit or Christ in you commanding us to do these things. If it's a command, it's a commandment, it's a law, isn't it? Strive to enter at the straight gate. Agonizomai, agonize. It's our word agonize. The agon was that arena there where they're feeding the Christians to the lions, or feeding them to the gladiators, or having the gladiators fight. It's a show. He says agonize. He says withdraw from people who walk disorderly, or withdraw from people who are preaching another doctrine. He says pull away from them. That is an imperative mood. He'll say humble yourself under the hand of God. Word is tepainoo. T-A-P-E-I-N-O-O. He says level yourself to God, not to man, to God. Withdraw ekklino. Lean away from. So these are laws, and you got hundreds of these in the New Testament. You say, I can't memorize all those, and I'm not going to be able to know what all the law of God is. It's written in your heart. You don't have to know it. When you come up against a right or a wrong, God says, I've written in your heart to know what's right. That you can sit there, well, I think I can do this. What do you think? Don't you think I can do this? When people start talking like that, you can't do that. You understand? When you have a doubt in your mind, I think I can justify my doing this over here. I'm going to justify it. What do you think? A lot of times I look at people and say, no, you shouldn't be doing that. Should you go into a bar? Well, no. I've had some people here ask me that. Should I go into a bar to meet this girl? Well, no. She said she wanted me to meet me in a bar. The reason she says that is she frequents the bar all the time. She knows the bartender. You're not supposed to have an appearance of evil. No. Just say it to each other, not with anger. Just, no, don't do that. Well, he's going to tell us all about that. Now, what I want us to do is go to Exodus, the 21st chapter, and start looking at these things that he's saying. All right. We've read some of them. Exodus 21. Now, these are the judgments. When he says these are the judgments, he says, I'm about to name for you the judgments of God for your daily living. He went through the 10 Commandments in the previous chapter. Here's your judgments. If you buy a Hebrew servant, which I will set before them, if thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. That was a bondservant. We said that last week. Bondservant. A bondservant was not a lifetime slave. A bondservant was when you owed somebody money. You owed money. Now remember, when you're talking about owing money or having an income, Israel was a poverty-stricken nation. That's why God had to promise them, if you follow me and keep my commandments, I'll fill up your storehouse, I'll fill up your womb, your kids will be healthy, I'll fill up your Your fields, I'll give you everything you need. I know you're poverty-stricken. They were a poor people. God says, I'll take care of you, and you'll whip your enemies. No matter how many come against you, you'll be able to beat them. That happened time and time again. It happened over there in the 20th chapter of First Kings, when Ahab was the king of Israel. He was an evil king, and Ben-Hadad comes down and says, I'm demanding your unconditional surrender. I'll kill all of you. God says, now that makes me mad. I don't like Ahab myself, but nobody's going to tell my kings when they're going to quit ruling. So he tells Ahab, you go out against these. He sends a prophet to Ahab, says, Ahab, you go against these Syrians, and when you go out there, you're going to conquer them. And they went out and camped against the Syrians. There were hundreds of thousands of Syrians. And the Bible says that when Israel camped against them, they were like two little flocks of kids. A kid is a goat. It looked like they were two little flocks encamping against this entire landscape of Syrians. And that day, Israel killed over 120-something thousand Syrians. Said, oh, God says, if you're obedient to me, that's what you'll be able to do. You say, that's not for us. Why can't I conquer? Because you're trying to do things your way and trying to conquer. You're trying to conquer this life your way instead of saying, Lord, whatever you have me do, I'll serve you 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But I can't do that. I'm too young. I know you can't yet. The time will come where you will completely surrender it over to God and say, Lord, whatever you want. And I believe like one of the Puritan writers said, he said, it's yet to be seen what God can do with a man that's completely committed to Him. Just 100%. God says, when you do that, then I deliver you. Not when you're half on the fence for yourself and half for me. It's not. God's not looking for a fence straddle to make you overcome His enemies. He's looking for somebody who's completely, and He's going to have to make you that way if you become that way. Now, let's continue to read here. If you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and 7th he shall go out free for nothing. That is according to the year of Jubilee in the Leviticus, the 25th chapter. They had a sabbatical year every 7 years. They had to free the slaves. All the land was given back to the original owners. All the land was given back to the original owners every 50th year. If a Jew had 5,000 acres of land, and it's the 48th year, and 2 years down the road is the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, every bit of that land had to go back to the original owner where it came from. And this man here had to start out again from square one. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. You got to go back to the beginning. The reason for that is to control the greed in Israel. Were they greedy? Just like everybody else. Now, like I said last week, a slave in Israel was not like an early slave in early America. Had nothing to do with that kind of a slave. A bond slave was usually a man that owed money to a master, and he would bring him into his home. He would pay his bills, feed him right, treat him like a son. That was kind of slave. In fact, if you were poor in a poverty-ridden Israel back 4,000 years ago, you would love to bring yourself and your family in subjection to a master because he's going to take care of you. He'd fight for you. You remember Eliezer, the chief servant in Abraham's household? Abraham loved Eliezer. He was a Syrian. And Eliezer was completely committed to Abraham. When God promised Abraham a son in the 15th chapter of Genesis, He said, it will not be this Eliezer, this Syrian, even though he's faithful to you and loves you. In all probability, a slave could be either a bond slave or he could be someone captured in battle. But if Israel captured a slave in battle, they found out being a slave in Israel was not like being a slave in Rome, or like being a slave in Syria. They beat you in Syria. You became like a son in the household in Israel. Let me read something to you about these slaves. This is very interesting stuff. This is out of Paul's metaphors. Let me read a little bit of this. Slavery found an integral part of the Roman way of life. Now, this is Roman slaves. It's not Israel's slaves. The difference between a slave in Rome or a slave in Syria, a slave in one of these other nations, and Israel was like the difference of being a son and a slave. Because sometimes that head of a household in Israel would not only bring you into the family, he'd give you an inheritance. And he was commanded by God, when you left, you had to be given plenty of provisions for plenty of years when you left that house as a slave. God didn't put up with mistreating slaves. He made you treat them like a son. A lot of men would not leave. They said, I don't want to leave this household. I want to be your slave the rest of my life. So they made a provision for that. He would have it all driven, A-U-L, driven through his ear against a doorpost, and it made him a slave forever is what it says, olam. But one writer says the year of Jubilee overcame that. It precluded that forever, or it meant the rest of his life, if that's what he wanted to be. It's an integral part of Roman life. Slaves had been a large part of the workforce that had served the wealthy in Italy and Sicily ever since the period of overseas expansion had begun at the end of the 3rd century BCE. That's before the Common Era, before the Christian era. According to the best modern estimates, there were about 2 million slaves in Italy by the end of the 1st century BCE. That's a lot of slaves, especially for their population. They didn't have the population in Italy they got now. Thus, slaves made up 35 to 40% of the total estimated population of the country of the Roman Empire, of Rome. Goes into slavery was certainly a fact of life. But in Rome, it wasn't as pleasant as being in Israel. You were taken care of in Israel. They were workers, miners, menial household servants, but not for all. Slaves could be found doing almost any job that a free person might do. There were builders, shoemakers, linen workers, bankers, book publishing, shopkeeping, clerical work, entertainment, medicine, teaching, philosophy, and the whole system. It goes on and on. Now, let me read something to you about the legal condition of slavery. We're slaves of Christ, aren't we? Every time Paul would say, Paul, a prisoner of Jesus Christ, it comes from the word doulos, which is the word slave. Every time he would say servant of Christ, it was slave of Christ. When he said he was a prisoner of Christ, he was kind of putting an opposing antithesis to his being a prisoner in Rome. He says, my prison, when I'm here in Rome, a prisoner of Rome, I'm actually a prisoner of Jesus Christ. The only reason I'm here is because I was with Christ, I spoke for him everywhere I went, and they made me a slave here. But my prison is actually for Christ. I wouldn't be here except for Christ. So he said I was a prisoner of Jesus Christ. Whenever he calls us stewards, a steward, let a man so account of us as stewards of Christ, or as ministers of Christ. When we are stewards, a steward, orko, N-O-M-I-A, orko, O-I-K-O, N-O-M-I-A. Oikonomia is the word steward. It is a construction of oikos, O-I-K-O-S, and nomos. Oikos means house, family, and nomos means law. It means the law of a household. This is the man who dispenses the law of a household. The steward was the highest ranking slave of the household. He's the guy that dispensed the economy. Economy. If you look up the word economy in Webster's dictionary, it will tell you it comes from the word oikos, nomia. If you say oikonomia, if you say that fast, oikonomia, economy, That's what you come up with. It's one who dispenses a household. The goods of a household. That's us. We're stewards. We're the highest slaves in the household. We're the house of God, aren't we? And we dispense the law from our mouths. Now, let me read some more about this to you. In Roman law, the head of the household held complete power over his slaves. The power of ownership, legally, every slave was absolutely subject to the will of his or her master. Slaves were classed as chattels. That's property. That's what a chattel is. Not persons. They were not people among the Romans. They're pieces of furniture. They could do with them what they want to. Cut their arms off, cut their tongues out, beat them, and no one could say anything about it. But that wasn't true in a household of the Jews. You'll see that as we're reading through here. Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. The word slave does not occur in this particular verse, but the image is certainly one of subjection to an absolute master, speaking us of being slave to Christ. Let me read to you about cruelty to slaves in Rome. This is why God says, I won't have that with my slaves. When Jewish slaves are a picture of us being prisoners of Christ, being his slaves or his servants. Roman literature abounds in examples of incidental cruelty to slaves. The Emperor Augustus, for example, ordered the legs of a trusted slave to be broken because he had abused his trust. Galen, the physician, noted that many slaves had their teeth broken and their eyes blackened by blows, and reported a particular instance in which the Emperor Hadrian stabbed a slave in the eye with a stylus in a moment of anger. They did what they wanted to him. God says, I won't have that in Israel. Seneca portrayed a master at dinner surrounded by slaves. The unfortunate slaves are not allowed to move their lips, let alone talk. The birch keeps murmuring down. A cough, a sneeze, a hiccup is rewarded by a flogging with no exceptions. Any break in the silence is severely punished. They stand at ready all night, tense and mute. It was a terrible way to live. If the lot of domestic or urban slaves was a hard one, that of rural slaves who labored on the estates or in the mines were infinitely worse. Diodorus wrote of slaves. He is a historian. In Spanish mines, where 40,000 are said to have worked, the slaves produce incredible profit for their masters. Well, so did the slaves in early America. I've said it before. I'll say it again. Thomas Jefferson said he didn't believe in slavery, but he could not run his nail factories without them. He was a hypocrite. I can't make money without them. Produced incredible profit for their masters, but they themselves wear out their bodies, digging underground by day and by night, and many of them die under the strain of such terrible conditions. They are not allowed any pause or rest from their work, but are forced by the blows of their overseers to endure sheer misery. Then Apulcius describes what he saw in a flour mill. I suspected this highly undesirable mill with a certain degree of pleasure. The men there were indescribable. Their entire skin was colored black and blue with wheals left by whippings. Their scarred backs were shaded rather than covered by tunics, which were patched and torn. Some of them wore no more than a tiny covering around their loins, but all were dressed in such a way that you could see through their rags. They had letters branded on their foreheads. Remember we talked about sealing. God seals us in our foreheads, and they sealed their slaves in their foreheads. Their hair had been partly shaved, and they had fetters on their feet. They were sallow and discolored, and smoky and steamy atmosphere had affected their eyelids and inflamed their eyes. Their bodies were a dirty white because of the flour dust. All slaves are enemies, ran a Roman proverb, and by and large they were treated as such by their masters. It wasn't like watching Charlton Heston in some movie. Slaves were at the mercy of their masters. They could be overworked and neglected, thrown out when old, beaten, or even killed, and mostly had no realistic chance of protecting themselves. Then it goes into branding the slaves. It goes into crucifixion. Goes into crucifixion of a slave. The only people who could be crucified in the first century was slaves and criminals. You had to be a criminal, you had to be a slave to be crucified in the Roman Empire. Jesus was considered a criminal. That's why they crucified him. It was against Roman law to crucify a Roman citizen. That's why in the 16th chapter of Acts, in the 16th chapter of Acts, Paul is taken prisoner at Philippi and put in a Philippian jail, but he's beaten first. And the next morning, the guards come in to say, okay, you can go now. He said, I'm not leaving. What's wrong? I'm a Roman citizen and you beat me. They went, whew, and they got scared and they started trembling. They were frightened that they could die for beating a Roman citizen. They didn't find out. They took him because of his preaching. And they found out they had beat the wrong man. So we see something about Roman law in that 16th chapter of Acts when Paul refused to leave the prison. He finally got up and walked out. He was making a point to him. You better find out who you're beating. Because he was from Tarsus. Tarsus is up here in the corner of Turkey and up here right about Syria in this area. And when he was born, the king of Rome, the Caesar of Rome, had made Tarsus a Roman state. Paul was a Jew living in Tarsus, but since that made it a Roman state, when he was born a Roman citizen. That's why they couldn't beat him. How are you going to know that if you don't read something inside the Bible? People say, I just read the Bible. That's all I read. That's dumb. That's self-righteous. And he goes into crucifixion of slaves. I won't go any further than this. What it takes, a slave's money. This is very interesting stuff. This is a book called Paul's Metaphors. You can buy that through, you can get that through, what's their name? Christian Book Distributors. CBD. You can go online and get that. That's a wonderful book. Got a lot of things. Now let's go back over here to Exodus 21. In verse 3, if this slave came to himself, the one that's been there 6 years, the seventh he has to be released, he shall go out by himself. But if he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. You cannot keep his wife like they did in early America. They would sell off a slave, keep the wife over here, break them up, split their home up, break their hearts. God says, that's cruel. I won't have that. So he says, I'll stop that. So evidently these slave owners in early America never read this, did they? I don't guess so. And his wife shall go with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. And because the wife has to be with the children. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife and my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him into the judges, and he shall also bring him to the door, unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and serve him forever. I'll go into forever. That is actually speaking of, in that text, till either the year of Jubilee or in the 6th year. After the 6th year, he has to be set free. And if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant is the same thing as a bondmaid. A maidservant is the father owes some money to this rich landowner, and he's got to sell his daughter to him to pay the debt. They're not just going around selling their children. God's saying, if you find this necessary, and you got to have somebody work this out, perhaps you're too old, perhaps you're too sick to go work out the debt that's owed, and you sell your daughter for a maidservant, and she shall not go out as the men servants do, if she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. She can be bought back if he has given her as a wife and the guy doesn't want her. To sell her into a strange nation, he shall have no power. God is saying, Israel, you can't sell your children to pagan Gentile people. He told his people to stay married even in the same nation, but not just in the same nation, in the same tribe. He's got some strict laws for them to live by here. You have to remember, they are people living out here in the wilderness. They're going to go live in a nation where they're the only ones in the world that's going to be serving Jehovah God. So he's got some strict guidelines for them. That's the same thing he's telling us. Don't intermarry with the world. Seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her, and if he have betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. If this man that's bought her buys her, he'll have to treat her like a daughter. That's what God is saying. I won't have slaves being mistreated. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage shall not be diminished. Alimony. You're not going to take advantage of these women. All through the Old Testament, the women were not even counted. All through the New, they weren't counted. When Jesus fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, every commentary will tell you that was men only. That's not counting the women and children. In all probability, in the 6th chapter of John, when he fed 5,000, there may have been 20,000 there with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes that were fed. Because they just counted the men. Women's vote didn't count. In fact, when the 2 women went to Jesus' tomb and found that he was Mary and the other Mary, and they found that he was gone, they came back and told the apostles, and the apostles didn't believe them because their vote didn't count. And Jesus is saying, I'm not going to keep putting up with this. That's why, well, I can go into the halakha of the Pharisees. If they saw a woman and they said, if the woman was better looking than their wife, or she wasn't as silly as their wife, then they could say, go to home, say, I divorce you, get out. And God says, you can't do that without a bill of divorcement and giving her half the proceeds in this. See, the women didn't count in the Old Testament, in the New. And Jesus said, I'm tired of that. And he's showing it right here. I'm not going to put up with mistreating the women or the slaves. I'm not going to put up with mistreatment anywhere in my nation. I'm the king here. You know who this king is right here? It's Jesus, pre-incarnate. And if he do not these 3 unto her, then she shall go out free. She gets to be released. If he will not meet his obligation, she can walk away from him. He that smiteth a man. Now, here we are back to capital punishment. We went into some capital punishment over in Genesis 9 and 6, that when a man sheds blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And everybody uses that to say, we believe in capital punishment in America. Well, how about all the other capital crimes in the Old Testament? You're going to use the Bible as your criteria for capital punishment? Let's go with all the rest of the crimes in the Old Testament, the capital crimes. I've gotten where I believe capital crimes only belongs to Israel. I don't care what the world does. Outside the church, I don't care what they do. They can kill the serial killers or let them send them to Hawaii. I don't care. That's Babylon's business. What have I to do to judge those who are outside the church? Paul said. And then he says, he that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. Oh, hey, there it is in the Old Testament. It doesn't say, let's give him 3 appeals over an 18-year period. It says, he kills a man, he dies. If a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand. If a man is not plotting the death of a man, if it is either what we would call manslaughter or second-degree murder, where it's on the spur of the moment, he's not plotting, he's not hiding in wait to kill him. That's what he's saying. Then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. And those places where he would flee until he could be tried, as we'll see later on in the Bible, was called cities of refuge. If a man could catch a man before he got to a city of refuge, he would kill him if he killed his brother or something. But if a man got to a city of refuge, that was set up by law that he could stay there until he was put on trial. That's what they were called. But if a man come presumptuously, plans it, premeditated murder. That's what this is talking about. If a man comes presumptuously, premeditated, upon his neighbor, to kill him with guile, trickery, thou shalt take him from mine altar that he may die. What does he mean, take him from the altar? Well, we're going to find in the law, that here's the brazen sea, here's the altar. The altar's got these horns on it. If a man has committed murder, he can come and grab hold of the horns of this altar, and you can't take him and kill him. Now you remember over there, look there in 2 Kings. 1 Kings. 1 Kings. Solomon is becoming king of Israel, and Ahithophel has tried to take the kingdom from him. Hold on a second here. He's tried to take the kingdom, and Ahithophel is Solomon's brother, and he tries to assume the throne instead of Solomon. And gosh, it's Joab. Joab. Well, what I'm saying is Ahithophel is trying to take the kingdom, and God sets him aside, and he tells Ahithophel, Solomon tells Ahithophel, his brother, who tries to take the throne away from Solomon, tries to bring about a coup, taking the throne. And Solomon and Ahithophel, gosh, it's a long story. Solomon finally puts him to death. I mean, just put it that way. What did I say? Ahithophel? Adonijah, excuse me. I've got the A's mixed up. Adonijah, not Ahithophel. Ahithophel's David's chief counselor over in 2 Samuel. Adonijah tries to take the kingdom. He goes and grabs hold of the horns of the altar. Benaiah is the commander-in-chief of Israel, and he says, you'll have to kill me while I'm here at the altar. And he goes back to Solomon and says, he's got a hold of the horns of the altar. He says, well, he's not absolved from this situation. Go over there and kill him. He says, you'll have to kill me on the altar. I got a hold of the horns. Well, you're a killer. So he killed him right there. This is what he's talking, and this is a law. This was sanctuary. The horns of the altar was sanctuary for a murderer unless he was a premeditated murderer. He could get away with it. Now, it doesn't mean he could get away. It meant until they could take him away from there and try him. He could come to the horns of the altar, or could go to a city of refuge until he could be tried in a court of law. See, this, I keep saying, this was their capital building. The priests and the Levites were their, I hate to use the word politician, they were their governing process. They were the senators and the lawyers and the mayors of the city hall. This would be like City Hall. And their law was kept inside the Ark of the Covenant there. Now, let's read on here. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Means to strike or to slay them. You kill your mom and dad, you have to die. He that stealeth a man and selleth him, kidnapping. Or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely die. He'll be put to death. Back in the 40s, when I was a little boy, the punishment of kidnapping was the electric chair, or they didn't put them to death by gas back then, or by hanging, or by firing squad. Even back in the 40s, Back in the 40s, espionage was, if you were a spy, in fact, the Rosenbergs back in 53 when I was in junior high school, I remember when they were put to death, they were spies, they were Russian spies, and they'd sold secrets. Some say that Ethel didn't have anything to do with it, but they put them to death. Nowadays, you can be a spy and pass secrets from one nation to the other, and this shows you how much we've changed. You might get 2 years in prison. Back in 1950, when I was a boy, when I was 12 years old, men who raped women, the penalty was a death sentence back then. It's not that now. You might get 3 years, right? Something like that, about 3 years, about the most you can get. But we changed that much. So here's what the Bible says compared to our laws. He that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. And when people say, I believe in the death penalty, do you believe what the Bible says in the Old Testament? You mean for cursing your father and your mother? How about for being a rebellious son? They were commanded to take him out. If he was incorrigible, and he couldn't be taught, and he refused, and he was rebellious, the Bible says take him out and kill him. Now, for which capital crime do you believe in capital punishment in America? First of all, who was this for here? Was this for Gentiles? No, this was for Israel, wasn't it? If it's for Israel, and Israel's the church, then the only people you can put to death are people in the church, right? Do we go around killing people? No, but do we have a spiritual death and a separation from them? Yes. Death means separation. It doesn't mean annihilation. It's the word Thanos or Thanatos. And a type of death would be a separation from people and say, until you repent, change your ways, I'll have no fellowship with you at all. You're out of my life. It's like the Jews would say, it's as though you are dead. Now, look here in verse 18. If a man strive together, and one smite another with a stone, or with his fist, and he die not, but he has to go to bed, he's going to have to pay him pecuniary damages. He's going to have to pay him damages for what he's done. If he be risen again and walk abroad on his staff, then shall he that smote him be quit or innocent. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time compensation. You want to know what you're supposed to do? This is what you're supposed to do. Shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed, where he doesn't lose anything. This is amazing. I was in music business, and I had a lead guitarist one time, and I had a diamond ring that flashed like crazy. And he said, "Can I borrow your diamond ring?" I said, "Well, you know that diamonds are very fragile, and if you hit them, they'll break and just go all to pieces." He said, "Oh, so?" I said, "Well, you're going to buy me a new one if you break it, right?" He said, "Well, no. God says, yes, you replace what you break." Sold that a long time ago. He's saying here, here's the way you're supposed to be living. If you borrow something from somebody, be honorable enough to return it the same way or buy a new one. You don't take advantage of people and hurt them as a Christian. And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. See, but the Romans said no, and all the rest of the people of the world said, no, I can kill my slave. God says you can't kill him in a Jewish household. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. The slave is his property. Now, people will say, this next verse, people say they can abort babies in America. This next few verses says, if you accidentally abort a baby and it die, or you cause any injury to it when a woman's carrying it, you have to pay eye for eye, foot for foot, tooth for tooth. Whatever you do to that baby, you have to pay the same price. Let's read it. If a man strive and hurt a woman with child, if two men are wrestling, so that her fruit depart, he's wrestling around with her or anything else. One thing you knew not to do, around a pregnant woman in Israel, don't mess around. You hurt her, the baby is injured, then you have to pay for what is lost in that womb. He says, and her fruit depart. The word means to bring out of her. It means you cause her to give birth. And yet no mischief follow, no acom, A-C-O-W-N. A-C-O-W-N. No hurt. All she does is give birth, and no hurt follow. He shall be surely punished according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any hurt, mischief follow, then shall that man that caused that abortion give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. If it causes an accidental abortion and a death of the baby, then you have to die that caused it. Now, this is talking about an accidental abortion. Do you think if God says you'll have to die if you cause an accidental abortion, do you think you're not going to have to die for causing a intentional abortion? Yeah, you certainly will. And if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish. These are things they live by every day, and it's what we need to live by. You can study these things and see how you need to live in your life and how responsible you need to be to others. Can't you? We're supposed to be responsible. Don't take advantage of somebody else's property and you won't restore it the same way you got it. That's what he's saying all through here. He shall let him go free for his eye's sake. If you got a servant and you destroy his eyesight, he's a free man. And if you smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he'll let him go free for his tooth's sake. Now, there's been people that have had animals. I saw on the TV one of those, some kind of show like 2020, and this dog catcher went out to get a pit bull. This woman had some pit bulls in her house. And he came out and mauled this fellow that worked for the dog pound, animal shelter. And I don't remember if it killed him or not, but in the ancient world, if it killed him, that person that knew that about that animal, after the first warning, they would have to die. Look at this. If an ox gore a man or a woman that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be innocent, since he can't stay out there with the oxen every day. But look what the next verse is. But if the ox were wont or were prone to push with his horn, or to gore with his horn, in time past, sometime in the past, when he had a tendency to go out and hurt people, and the owner knows it, and he hath been testified to his owner, and his owner already knows that, and he hath not kept him in, but that hath killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and his owner also shall be put to death. Now, which capital crime are you talking about? You understand what I'm saying? There's more to capital punishment than just murder. If you're going to use the Bible as your standard, use all the standard of the Old Testament. If there be laid on him a sum of money, then he shall give for ransom of his life whatsoever is laid upon him by the law. This kind of makes things pretty tight in our society, doesn't it? You have an obligation to the property of others as a believer. especially if you borrow something. Don't borrow something from somebody and you don't tend to take care of it or them. We're supposed to be looking out for one another. Paul said, look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. He said, you look out for other people's stuff. Make sure it's protected. That's biblical. That's being a good Christian. We seem so quickly to take advantage of each other, don't we? Whether he have gored a son or gored a daughter, according to this judgment shall it be done unto him. Whatever you do to a son or daughter, that bull or that pit bull or that chow or that Welsh corgi or that whatever, or that German shepherd or whatever it is, if you know your animal, there's something that always bothers me. People say, he won't hurt anybody, and it's a Doberman Pinscher going, "Arr." He's all right, he's fine. Well, he's fine to you because you're the owner. You don't know what he'll do to a stranger. I say, no, I won't go in there. If the ox shall push a manservant, push means to gore, or a maidservant, he shall give unto their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be killed, stoned. If a man shall open a pit, is this kind of daily living? Does this kind of apply to us? Do right by your neighbor. When he said, love your neighbor as yourself, the last 6 things, he's going into this 21st chapter and telling you how to love your neighbor, isn't he? Don't do wrong to people. We know what right and wrong is, don't we? If a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and dig a hole in the yard out there, in the field next door, you don't cover it up, and an ox or an ass fall therein, the owner of the pit is going to make it good. You've got obligations towards other people. You can't live your life haphazardly and sloppy and be a Christian and just live along in life, living the way you want to as long as you're taken care of. You see, these laws are for us, aren't they? The owner of the pit shall make it good and give money unto the owner of them, and the dead beast shall be his. Your beast fell into the hole. And if one man's ox hurt another's, that he die, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money of it, and the dead ox also shall they divide. According to the law of God, you've got some obligations to live by and stand up to. Or if it be known that the ox hath used to push in time past, and his owner hath not kept him in, he shall surely pay the ox for ox, and the dead shall be his own. Let's read chapter 22. Do I have any time, Mike? Okay. I want you to see some of this law to understand that it has to do with our daily living and our obligation to each other. Do you think this, when the Bible says all Scripture is given by inspiration from God and is profitable, do you think this 21st chapter of Exodus is profitable for us? How to treat people, how to treat one another, what your obligation is, and what you should pay back if you let something that you have cause damage to somebody else through your negligence. God says you can't be negligent and be a Christian. Not be the kind of Christian you're supposed to be. Chapter 22. If a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If you steal something and kill it, if you take something from somebody else and you get caught, you got to either give 4 for 1 or 5 for 1. That's the kind of obligation we have towards other people. Don't steal from other people. Don't mistreat somebody else's property. That's what this is saying. A lot of times we don't know where it is in the Bible that we shouldn't mistreat each other's property when we take advantage of one another. Well, here it is right here. If a thief be found breaking up and be smitten, that he die, there shall no blood be shed for him. If a man's breaking into your house and you kill him, for breaking into your house. Break up means their walls of their houses were made of mud and brick. And the way the thieves, when the Bible speaks thieves breaking in and stealing, there in the 10th chapter of John, thieves break through and steal. They broke through the side of the house. If a thief breaks in and he gets killed in his thievery, then there's not going to be any mourning for him, and nobody's going to pay for it. If the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him. For he shall make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he shall be sold for stealing. If the theft be certainly found in his hand alive, whether it be an ox, an ass, or a sheep, he has to give the man back double. That's what you call pecuniary damage. That's restitution. If a man shall cause a field or vineyard to be eaten, and shall put up his beast, and shall feed in another man's field, of the best of his own field, and of the best of his own vineyard, you make restitution. You know what he's saying through all of this? Do right. Treat other people right. And when you destroy something that belongs to somebody else, feel obligated to restore it and to give them something new if necessary, if you have to go borrow the money. You know that when you do that, you have a reputation you cannot buy. People say, man, he's a man of his word. You can trust him. If I tell you something, if I tell you I'll do something, I've learned this. There was a time I didn't do this. If I tell you something right now, like there's an old saying, you can go take it to the bank today. I will die before I will not do something I promise somebody. I'll do it or I'll die. And I've told some people here that. It took years to learn that. It took years to learn to not take advantage of people. Everybody has some of that in them. You know that, don't you? It's really easy when you say, I think I got away with this. I came out smelling like a rose on this, and you know that what you did was wrong to that person. Because they didn't learn it and they don't know it, you think, I'm come home free, not according to God. If fire break out and catch in thorns, so that the stacks of corn, or the standing corn, or the field be consumed therewith, he that kindled the fire shall make restitution. You got to pay it all back. You say, why does God have to name all of these individual things? Because sometimes believers just don't get it the first time around. How many times you have to tell your kids, don't do that, don't do that. I said don't do that. So God has to tell us over and over and over, you're so simple-minded as sheep, I'm going to name everything for you. If a man shall deliver unto his neighbor money or stuff to keep, and it be stolen out of the man's house, if the thief be found, let the thief pay double. If the thief be not found, then the master of the house shall be brought unto the judges to see whether he have put his hand upon his neighbor's goods. The guy said, keep this $1,000 for me till I come back. If one of you tell me, here, I got $1,000, keep for me, I can put it in a drawer at my house, and you say, I'll be back in 10 years. It'll be there in 10 years. That's the way I feel about things. I have learned keeping what's not mine makes me miserable over a period of time. I just feel terrible. I do not feel, you can't live righteous and holy by doing that. Don't think you've come out by the checker at the store didn't charge you for one item. Hey, man, they didn't charge me this $4.98 item. Hey, I came out on that. No, you didn't. Your heart hasn't been changed enough yet to be completely honest. The Bible says we need to be honest in all things. God has had to deal with me on that severely. I used to steal things when I was young. I used to steal things I didn't think were important, like ballpoint pens. And you know how I learned to do that? I watched my brother, my older brother. I said, if Clyde can do that, I can do that. And God had to deal with me on little things, on the little sins, on the little thefts in life. You say, I never have been a thief. Well, what have you done? What is it you have to address your life on these little sins? For all manner of trespass, whether it be for ox or for ass or sheep or for raiment, or for any manner of lost thing, which another challenges to be his, the cause of both parties shall come before the judges, whom the judges shall condemn. He shall pay double unto his neighbor. If a man deliver unto his neighbor an ass or an ox or a sheep or a beast to keep, and it die or be hurt or driven away, no man sing it, then shall an oath of the Lord be between them both, that he that hath put his hand unto his neighbor's goods, and the owner of it shall accept it thereof, and he shall not make it good. That's the man that took it, but he didn't have anything to do with it, with losing it. If you're not responsible and you're trying to help somebody take care of something, and some thief comes in and steals it, he says you're not accountable for it. But if it's your slothfulness and your laziness that causes these things to happen, he says you need to make restitution. And you know when you're wrong. That's what God is saying. You know when you're wrong. People say, well, I just don't know if this is right or wrong. Well, if you don't know if it's right or wrong, stay away from it until you find out. Huh? These are little things that we have to learn, because we have these things going on in our families and among the church and with the little kids and with our own kids, and you're trying to deceive your kids, or they're trying to deceive you. If you live godly, be accountable and responsible for everything. We've been predestined to conform to the likeness of Jesus. Do you think that he tried to trick people? There was no guile in his mouth. Guile means to live by trickery. Your actions are your trickery. He's saying, I don't want no trickery here. Be totally honest with each other. If you cause something to be lost that belonged to this neighbor here, if it's his reputation you've caused, you need to go back and apologize and tell the people who you have gossiped to that you're sorry, you were wrong. This is all underlying in this whole text here. He's totally honest with everything you do. He says, if it be stolen from him, he shall make restitution unto the owner thereof. If it be torn in pieces, then let him bring it for witness, and he shall make good that which is torn. If a man borrow aught of his neighbor, in verse 14, and it be hurt or die, the owner thereof being not with it, this man that borrowed it shall make it good. We've been saying that all night. Don't take advantage of people just because you can. Somebody's easygoing and you got a driven personality, and you can seduce them into doing things where they're going to be hurt. Then you're going to say, it was not my fault. How many have done that? He's saying, don't trick each other. These are laws for us, because this tells us how we live in life. But if the owner thereof be with it, he shall make it good. He shall not make it good. If the owner is there, if it be an hired thing, it came for his hire. If a man entice a maid that is not betrothed and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. Ooh-wee. Does that apply today? You start sleeping around, you've got to marry her, he says. Huh? And we got all these people saying, well, I just think it's okay to sleep together outside of marriage. Well, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible calls it fornication. If her father utterly refuse to give her unto this man, he shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Kasaf. Kasaf is the word witch. It means someone who talks smooth. It means a smooth talker, someone who is enchanting. A witch was not, in Israel, was not a hook-nosed woman that had warts all over her face, that rode a broom and she was scrawny and was ugly. That wasn't a witch. A witch was Billy Graham. It was Charles Stanley. It was Kenneth Copeland. Soft speaker. One who claimed to talk to the dead so they could tell you about your dead father or mother or grandparents, so that you would pass some money into my palm and I'll tell you your fortune. Those people on TV, they don't know how evil they are. Whosoever lieth with a beast shall surely be put to death. That's talking about sexual relations with an animal. That goes on in some of the third world countries. It probably goes on some here in America. In these sex shows behind the scenes. He that sacrificeth unto any god, save unto the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. There's another capital crime. You sacrifice to another god. Well, what's the god you sacrifice to? Self. Remember, idolatria is idolatry. That's another god worship. That's serving what you see. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, Israel had the laws of hospitality that they took care of strangers in their household, even above their own families. Guests in their house. And I love this next verse. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child, Kenneth Copeland, and steal their money. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath shall wax hot against you, T.D. Jakes. And Jesse Duplantis, I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. I love that verse. You oppress the poor and the needy, and TBN, DB, the Devil's Broadcasting Network, says, send us if you're trying to pay your light bill, you send us your last nickel, and God will restore this 100-fold. And people have to move out of their houses because they don't have any lights, have to go stay a week with their daughter, or 2 weeks until they can get money to pay their light bill because they sent it to that purple-haired woman up here. Do you know this is an indictment against them? These guys are idiots. They're fools. When you look over there, how much time do they have, Mike?
6 minutes.
Look over here. These guys are fools with TBN. I believe they are the men there in Matthew 7. They're in 20, 21, 22, where they're going to say, Lord, haven't we prophesied in thy name cast out devils, in thy name done many wonderful works? He's going to say, depart from you that work iniquity. I never knew you. I believe this is who these men are, as these lying preachers. There's one guy with the Devil's Broadcasting Network. He's from Fort Worth. His name is John Avanzini. He's got ruts in his face about 6 inches deep. He's an old man. He dyes his hair pitch black. I guess he's trying to look like Elvis. And they call him in. He's ugly as sin. And they call him in to preach the hundredfold blessing. And that's not even what that's talking about in Mark the 10th chapter. But he preaches this right here in chapter 12 of Mark, in verse 41. This goes along with if you oppress the widow and the orphan. And Jesus sat over against the treasury, verse 41, beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. Many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which made a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and said unto them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast more in than all they which cast into the treasury. For they all cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. And that ignoramus, John Avanzini, says, she wanted something. That's what she gave to God. The guy is an imbecile. The word want is husteresis, Husteresis. Husteresis means of her poverty. Doesn't mean she wanted something. When the Bible speaks of want, it's not talking about I want. When the Bible speaks of a man who is in want, it's talking about in need. And he says that she cast in, it means deficit or poverty. Now here's why you need to read the other accounts in the other Gospels. There's an account of this in Luke 21. Look at Luke 21. Read Luke's account, it doesn't say want. Luke 21. Verse 1, he looked up and saw the rich men casting the gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow casting in thither 2 mites. And he said, of a truth I say unto you that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all these have of their abundance cast in the offering of God. But she of her penury, not want, I want something. Penury is the same word, husterema. It's Husterema. And husterema means poverty or lacking. She was lacking everything, and she gave all that she had. But she of her penury hath cast in all the living she had. And she wasn't wanting anything from God. You can't give to God to get. The Bible teaches us that. Because of Him and through Him and to Him are all things. You can't give to God. He owns everything. And we're back over here, and am I out of time? 1 minute. I'll just read a little bit of this over here in Exodus 21. He says, I'm going to kill you if you oppress the poor and the needy. Jesus said the poor will always be with us. And don't you oppress them. If you do, I am after you, God said. That's why I have a desire for the poor, needy believers. Do you know if you go to them, they'll say, well, I got mine by believing. You go get yours by believing. No, you got yours by a con, you crooks. People wonder why I get mad at them. If they were just lying to me only, I wouldn't pay attention to them. They're hurting the poor. The TBN, or the Devil's Broadcasting Network, they appealed to the downtrodden and the poor. Because it's the poor that's desperate and in trouble. And they'll say, you go borrow $2,000. They even, that idiot, R.W. Schambach, got on there one night and said, you need to send in $2,000. If you send it $1,000, that's not enough. You send in $2,000. You can borrow it from your neighbors and from your mother and your father. And that stupid Jan Crouch will get on there and say, she'll say, there's a little lady out there, and this is purple hair up there, and I know you're out there and you've got $100 in a fruit jar. If you are telecasting all over the world, there's 10,000 ladies with money in a fruit jar. And they all send it in. Well, I got $200, but they're talking to me. God's going to give me a double blessing if I send in the 200. These people are crooks. This book of Exodus is telling us how we're supposed to live in our everyday life and not take advantage of each other. And you're responsible. People say, it's none of your business. It certainly is from the Christian viewpoint. Everybody here is our business, that we take care of them. We need to look on, Paul said again, he said, man, let a man look on every other man's wealth, not his own. What you're supposed to do is take care of others. I keep saying this. If you've got a circle of people, if you got 10 people in a circle, and everybody is looking out for everybody else, and they're not looking out for themselves, how many people do you have looking out for you? You've got 9 people looking out for you. You don't have to look out for yourself. When you really look out for other people, they will be thinking of you when you're in trouble. Jesus said there were 10 lepers that were cleansed, and only one came back to praise God for what had happened. The rest of them just went on their way. There's a responsibility and an accountability. We're predestined to be like Jesus. That's what predestination's about. He's telling us in this book of Exodus how we're supposed to be living in our daily life. to be responsible to each other. Is anybody guilty of not being, just thinking about yourself? I think we've all done that, haven't we? Let's pray. Father, thank you for truth. God, help us to continue this work. Help us to understand this book. Help this to come home and hit our hearts, Lord, and cut into us. God, we pray that you'll cause the sheep to mature, to grow up. We know it takes a long time to do that, Lord. We know living in hard times. We pray that you'll cut into the hearts of the people of grace and truth, that they'll begin to learn and grow and mature in the faith and think of others and not themselves. Lead us to your elect. Open up doors for the ministry, and we'll give you praise in Christ's name. Amen.
Pastor, that was a good meal you gave us today.
Well, we need to learn. We have a responsibility. But don't say, hey, did you hear that? Did you hear that? As though it wasn't for each one of us.